Would you please join me in welcoming our panel today? The format of this panel is I'm going to throw a few questions out there to you guys, and then I'm going to give it to the audience to have your questions, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say and what your thoughts are for the panel. So first question for the group, I'm going to start with you, Gigi, and then work across the panel. What do you think behavioural economics can add to public policy, if anything at all useful, and in what context, where does it work and where doesn't it work, basically?
Okay. So I sense that you're coming at this from a somewhat pessimistic framework, my dear. So behavioral economics has obviously come a long way in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I think we heard in another panel earlier today that it was really just a collection of big ideas and not very much evidence, and now it's kind of taking over in public policy, and there are lots of consultants who are making their living out of it now. I guess my stance as a behavioral economist has been much more oriented towards theory and concepts and sort of overarching understanding of the human condition from a more multidisciplinary perspective than has traditionally been taught and been researched in economics. And so from that perspective, a lot of what behavioral economics ends up being in an applied coalface setting is rather low level, right? It's not particularly satisfactory intellectually speaking. So, for example, you'll get people who will put forth, because of behavioral economics, now we know that in this particular intervention at this particular time in this place, we should be mindful of the possibility of loss aversion. And therefore, we should make sure we give the benefit up front and only claw it back if the people don't perform, for example, right? That's sort of one of the main quote-unquote insights that's often peddled, but it's somewhat divorced from an aggregate understanding of how people interact that's broader than what economics has traditionally provided. So I suppose what I think is that there isn't... at the moment, in a lot of the ways in which behavioral economics is being deployed in the world, there isn't a large marginal impact that can be made unless we are talking about really big social change, which is, obviously extremely difficult. But there are many smaller marginal changes, marginal impacts that can be made in a wide variety of areas. So one, for example, would be the increased understanding we have because of behavioral economics of how important social connections, network, sense of identity is to people. In terms of their welfare, in terms of their competence, in terms of their motivation. So we can use this, for example, if we're trying to reach out to older people who may be isolated in the community, if we're trying to reach out to young people who can't be integrated as easily, aren't able to find jobs or want to get retrained, we can try to put money and resources towards retaining those people's connections with others in the community in various ways. In fact, we can put those two groups together, kind of playing Tetris, bring the young people into the old folks' homes, why not? You can learn a bit and everybody has a better time. So there's a bit of redirection of some of the money, the resources that are put towards helping vulnerable people that can be informed not just by traditional economics saying, you need to have training in order to get a job, but also this notion that community is important. So maybe have that training be accompanied by, social support, community activities, sporting engagements or subsidizations, whatever, which would keep them more integrated. There's also some innovations in terms of health outcomes that would that build on the sort of nudge phenomenon of salience. So, putting the bananas at a more easily reachable place than the potato chips for children and keeps them a little bit thinner, maybe. Making it easier for people to make the right choice in all sorts of various little ways, in particularly in relation to health, but also other things, potentially crime and whatnot, that you could actually intervene in small ways because of the fact that people focus. And we know that now because of studies of salience and how important it is. We can't possibly give all of our attention to everything all at once. So if you use that in a directed way, you can actually get people to make better decisions. So I think those would be probably the big two that I would think of. But I would also just, again, emphasize the big picture here is behavioral economics is more theoretically exciting than it is exciting at an empirical level, from my perspective.
Interesting. So I want to hand it over to you, Alex. So Gigi has mentioned that where it really works, where the impact is in those small changes, and it's more the empirical stuff can't really look at the bigger picture like the theory can. Would you agree with that? Or what's your perspective on where behavioural economics works in public policy and where it hasn't worked, and can we tackle the bigger issues?
Yeah, I think I guess maybe take a slightly more positive view on that. I think we are really at the beginning of scratching the surface of what we can bring to public policy and public services. I mean, pretty much I've made this point before, pretty much every public policy and service is designed with certain assumptions about human behaviour, and I think that those models are sometimes correct, but quite frequently they're not correct. And I think that ability to better fit what we're doing to how people actually are behaving in the real world has a lot of potential. Now, a lot of it started off pretty small, small changes to letters and text messages and things like that. But I think there's a lot of potential to move into much more complex areas of interventions. Our team has made a lot of use of things like goal planning and implementation intentions, which can be quite a powerful force for everything from getting people to lose weight to getting people back to work. And we're currently doing some work around using it to try and reduce certain types of crime. So I think there is potential for it to move from all the little stuff into increasingly bigger areas. I guess there are some corollaries to attach to that, which is that I guess the challenge for us is that once you move away from a kind of theoretically pure rational model, if I can put it this way, your predictive power kind of starts to collapse. It becomes much harder to say definitively, this is how you should deal with this scenario, because actually we look at a scenario, we think actually there's 9 factors that mean it will go up and there's 7 factors that mean it will go down, but we can't aggregate that prima facie. We need to actually test it. So you start to move into a much more empirical world of having to test which in that particular context, that particular scenario, is going to actually be the outcome. That's not a bad thing. I think in fact that's missing in government. So I think behavioural economics is actually sort of by the back door been bringing in a much more experimental approach to government, which is itself an incredibly valuable outcome. And just the other thing I wanted to say was that it's easy also to overlook the power of the small, which is incidentally the potential title of the autobiography that I'll be writing at some point, almost my book on behavioural economics. I just thought of it this morning. The power of the small has a nice ring to it. So I often get people's challenges say, well, look, you moved this scenario, you took it was 24%, whatever that number was, number of people doing X. You've moved it to 27%. Statistically significant, but you've moved it. That's great, but sort of what was the point? I mean, we want to get it to 90, 95%. We're not solving the problems of the world here. Why are you bothering? And actually, I started off in my career, my journey in behavioural sciences by being a bit apologetic about that, sort of saying, oh yeah, I do understand, but we do need to solve the big problems, but still, it doesn't hurt to do little stuff. I guess I've become increasingly aggressive and strident in my response to that, and actually pushing back on that and saying to people, well, just because you're not solving the problem in one go shouldn't stop you from that kind of incremental improvement, right? I think, in fact, if anything, government spends far too long and too much energy on the next big reform, the flashy system reform that's going to solve the problem of the world. And usually it doesn't. We know it doesn't. You spend huge amounts of time and energy and effort reforming complex systems, and then somehow you think, well, did it really make anything better at the end of the day? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And you overlook these small incremental changes we can make, but you're just going to have that Toyota-style kind of Kaizen mentality, relentless continuous improvement. That could really, I think, is an overlooked part of government culture. It's not really part of government culture. That continual improvement, relentlessly driving. How do we get another 1%, another 2% here? And if we embedded that in government along with an experimental culture, maybe we wouldn't need quite so many big reforms because we would be pushing all these numbers up all the time. And the other thing about the power of the small is that even a sort of quite a little deviation in someone's life course at a certain moment can affect, the entire life course. If we can get someone, imagine a small nudge, a text message or a letter that might affect someone early on in say, 18 or 19, and maybe it's just enough to change push them out of committing a crime, and that could maybe change the entire pattern of the rest of their life, a cycle of domestic violence, drug abuse, family violence, all sorts of things that could have gone down that pathway. And maybe a little change would be enough. So although the actual change might be small, it could sort of compound. When talking to a room full of economists about power of compound interest should be fairly well understood, that can compound over time. So those impacts can end up adding up, being something quite big.
Thanks, Alex. To stay on that point, Michelle, you work in ASICs, so as a regulator. Are you invested in the power of the small, or do you really need to look at the bigger issues? And do you think behavioural insights or behavioural economics can really address that in a meaningful way, or in the context that you use your behavioural economics in your work?
Sure. Well, I guess the way that we use BE at ASIC is really in an empirical way. So I would say that the strength of BE is actually its empiricism. And so I guess it's more of a microeconomics rather than macroeconomics. And the insight that we really have drawn on that BE gave us is that there is no universal rational agent. There is no universal self-interested utility maximizer. Instead, people behave differently in different contexts, and they have different influences, whether they're internal influences or external influences. So I think we have to remember that a lot of the ideas that regulation are built upon, whether it's known or not known, it's influenced by that idea that comes from that neoclassical economic paradigm, that there is one type of person who is a rational person, and if you give them sufficient information, they'll be able to make a decision that is in their best interest economically. And the research that we've done over many years has shown us that that's not necessarily the case, and that we need to look at regulatory problems in their context. So it's not necessarily about small changes, but it is about knowing that different financial products, different financial services, different groups of people are going to react differently and be motivated by different things. So what we draw on from BE in our behavioural unit that we have at ASIC is to really take that empirical research-based approach using a range of different research methodologies. So we have people from communications backgrounds, psychology, economics, law, social science, market research, and we draw all these different skill sets together to take as broad as possible approach to understanding any type of regulatory issue. So it's kind of taking a bite from what we've learnt from behavioural economics and kind of questioning some of those traditional economic assumptions that really influence the work of a lot of the economists and lawyers that work in our agency.
That's a pretty bold statement, Michelle. There is no economic rational agent. I want to hand it over. I'll give you some time to talk on that. But that's a bold statement to say to a bunch of economists. But Roy, what do you think? Is it just an infinite amount of context and we can't predict everyone's behaviour and there's an infinite amount of different behaviours? Is there even a place for looking at such a bespoke model, or should we just go back to basics? I mean, how much value can we add in the public policy sphere?
So I think one of the things that this approach has brought to government is a humility to understand actually that the context is incredibly important, and all of these strategies that we dream up at the centre might not play out in the way that we want, which is why Alex's point around the empirical approach being so valuable, I think is such an important one. So I think the idea that context is important is incredibly valuable, but of course it can't stop there. And actually what BI does is be able to give us some systematic biases and frameworks with which to understand behaviour. So I think it's important to say context and environment, is incredibly important, but then to look at some of the broader trends and frameworks as well as Gigi was saying. In terms of the sort of small versus sort of large-scale reforms, I think me and Alex are probably very closely aligned in defending almost the moral obligation of government to be focused on optimising our services wherever we can and getting efficiencies and trying to improve well-being. But I think the step that we've probably missed or not focused on quite enough is the scale point. So, having a 3-5 percentage point impact actually is an incredibly powerful thing, and it may change the lives if we just did some work around trying to encourage kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to apply to, more competitive universities in the UK. And again, that sort of 3-5%, that can really change the trajectory of someone's life. But if it stays as a trial of a few hundred or even a few thousand people, you're talking about shifting the life of 10, 20, 50 people, which is really very, very valuable. But it's nowhere near as valuable if you can then scale that across the system. And probably overall as an approach, I would say that's a big focus of ours for the next 5 years, is to translate some of these fantastic results and empirical results and think about how do we actually get them through the system.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to give you a chance now, Michelle, to respond to that.
Yeah.
So in terms of your unpacking your comment on there is no economic rational agent.
Look, I should say there are some rational people around, there are some hyper-rational people around, but we don't see people as inherently being able to... I guess where we come from with this is, in terms of regulation, ASIC oversees a disclosure-based regime. And the idea underpinning that is that problems in the investment space and in the finance space were created by information asymmetry. And if you just gave the end users of a product the same information as the makers or the sellers of a product, that they would be able to determine whether that product would be suitable for them and their circumstances. We've been doing research with financial consumers and retail investors for coming up to 15 years that's been influenced by behavioural ideas. And we've found over and over again that no one is taking that disclosure, no one is taking the information that we are ensuring that large firms put out there for consumers and reading it. And if they do read it, they don't understand it. We see this with the terms and conditions. I read this article yesterday where there's a European company, a Wi-Fi company, who had thousands of people agree to clean toilets by signing up to their free Wi-Fi in public areas. And they said they're not going to implement it. It's just a marketing campaign to raise awareness about this. But we know at ASIC that people don't read disclosure. Yet our most important, a regulatory tool that is fundamental to our operations is ensuring effective disclosure. So when I say that people aren't rational economic agents, I would stand by that, and I would say that people are not necessarily irrational. There is no this or that, but people are subjective and they are subject to a range of emotions, influences, people, different times of the day. Anything might alter how they make a judgment or come to a decision, and I think that's really a key insight that needs to be brought into both the policy and the regulatory space and government decision making in general.
Okay, yeah. Gigi, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, can I just make a point about rational inattention? Because this is also a behavioral economics concept, of course. I was actually at the Society for the Advancement of Behavioral Economics meeting in Newcastle a couple of weeks ago, organized by Morris Altman, and one of the keynote speakers was Paul Glimcher, who's a neuroscientist, as you probably know. And he gave a great, talk, and one of the main takeaways of the talk was that because mental effort is so costly to the human organism, right, and because there are so many infinite and diverse, wonderful ways we can use that effort, we have to decide, at a level far below the conscious one, how we're going to spend that effort every microsecond of the day. And it is simply not sort of rational to spend all of the time going through all of the very, very fine print in every disclosure piece of documentation that we are receiving with a financial instrument to verify that this is what we really want, because you know what, it's a mobile phone plan. I know I want one that's roughly okay, yeah, I'll just take it, right? Because that's rational in the moment. The opportunity cost is huge of spending that extra half an hour going through this, and just you're going to have to eat more and you're going to feel tired, and for what, right? The expected value, the expected return is so low. So I think there's an aspect of, this would inform sort of, low paper regulations, like make it simple. And it's not because people are dumb. It's because they're rationally inattentive.
I think that's a dictionary definition of rational, but that's not necessarily the rational economic agent type. Because you're not actively making a decision to be attentive or inattentive. It's something that's...
It's constrained optimization, where the constraint may not be conscious.
I would say it's not conscious, yeah. So I don't know that is when I think of rational, I think of thoughtfulness, and I think of actively.
We can have a very long discussion about that.
I think it's one of these words, I think rational is one of those words personally I always trying to steer away from. People often ask me questions in meetings about, are people rational? I think actually it's an interesting theoretical debate, but I think it can obfuscate the more important point, which is that whatever you call it, we often have an assumption about when we're designing our policy about the behaviour, and that behaviour is not seen. Whether that behaviour is rational or not is a kind of more interesting theoretical. From a practical point of view, all you care about is the kind of, is there a divergence between the assumption you made and then what you saw in reality?
Rory?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think Kahneman often says the same as well, that we often get caught up in this, is it rational or irrational? But I think, and the point Judy's making, which I think is very important from a public policy point of view, is this idea of scarcity and the bandwidth tax, and particularly for people who are on low income, who are using much of their mental energy on just getting through the day and juggling their finances, that actually we should really think about as a government what additional bandwidth tax we are creating when we design these services. So how difficult is it to access the tax system, the benefit system, the health system, etc.? And I think probably we have paid too little attention to those bandwidth taxes that we're imposing on the public, but particularly those on the lowest income.
So just one more thing I was going to say, I guess while we're on the subject of definitions, I think I actually have sympathy from Judy's point of view about the behavioural economics can often be more interesting theoretically than applied, if I'm being fair in saying that. I think partly the divergence between us is around the definition of how you draw the concept of behavioural economics. I think you're talking about behavioural economics in I would say, the real sense of behavioural economics, whereas I think the three of us slightly respond in a more wide, slightly bastardised version of the concept of behavioural economics, where we've actually drawn the field much wider and started talking about Michelle was even talking about bringing in other disciplines. We talk about behavioural insights or behavioural sciences. What we're looking at is not what does pure behavioural economics tell us that's practical. It's more how do you build that together with many other aspects of behavioural sciences and then collectively use that to drive things forward. So that I think slightly does change the answer to the question.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I guess when I say that the theoretical insights or theoretical potential of behavioral economics is the most exciting to me, it's because of the fact that it offers opportunities to combine traditional economics thinking with thinking from outside economics. So in a sense, being just as broad, but just at the theoretical perspective. I mean, so the title of the book that I wrote with Paul Freiters, Economic Theory of Love, right? We have love in there, groups. Love and groups do not play a part in mainstream economics. We have the atomistic individualizing, agent. And if you start to think about humans as they truly are, which involves looking at insights from psychology, anthropology, sociology, political science, history, evolutionary biology, all these different disciplines which are completely valid and economists have a reputation for poo-pooing all the time, but they've been around for a long time and they've done a lot of interesting stuff. If you look at people that broadly, you start to uncover the possibility of these sort of systematic ways in which people behave, ways in which they respond to their environment, which, as you were saying, is so important to understand in order to then understand the heterogeneity that you see in individuals, right? If you understand the general trends, what are people generally going to be responding to? So what is why are people loyal to certain things? And once that loyalty is there, you know that people are going to behave differently than before it's there. But you need to understand how it comes about in order to then make any sort of prediction about who's going to behave those ways and who's not. So that's why I like the theoretical side, because it does offer the potential to come up with more, sort of generalized principles about human behavior, which are far beyond what economics has delivered so far.
I think what's tricky with that is that when you find general trends and then you call them universal trends, or not necessarily call them universal trends, but when you're in the policy-making position, you've got to create policy based on what you see as those trends. And what we're saying, the way that we're bringing in BE insights is to say that that's not universal. So what does ASIC do? We administer the consumer protection law. So we're trying to ensure that people who are engaging with financial services are doing so in a way that they're not going to they're going to be able to make decisions based on risk profiles, but they need to know what their risk profiles are. But we can't administer that law. I guess, what am I trying to say? That there might be different groups that need different protections rather than just creating single policies or taking singular approaches for the general trend that we see in groups. So I guess that's our approach.
Going back to your point, Gigi, of having a more of a universal theory around behavioural economics. I mean, I want to hear from the other panel members, is this a real challenge for the discipline in general and applying it to public policy? Are we just making tweaks of little letters with no real overarching kind of framework and theory, and are we moving in a direction at all, or are we just going around in circles with these little minor tweaks? I'm going to hand it over to you, Rory.
So let's go back to the point earlier on. So I don't think... Sometimes I'm less worried about building the model when we're more focused on the impact. So, for example, changing tweaking a letter, social norms, for example, we might be drawing on the evidence around that. If you're bringing forward hundreds of millions of pounds in terms that they can then be spent on other types of program, to me, that's a real contribution we shouldn't overlook. It shouldn't end there, right? We should be building the evidence base, we should be transparent, we should be testing different types. In fact, just on that simple point, BOT was obviously involved in some of those early trials around, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. The more iterations that we've got of that, we've actually been able to unpack what is actually at play. So actually highlighting that 9 out of 10 people in your local area, so 9 out of 10 people in Sydney pay their tax on time. This makes you part of a small minority who hasn't, is actually far more effective than just the 9 out of 10. But really importantly, and I think building on the point Gigi and Michelle have just made, we're now able to see who is that most effective for and who is it least effective for. So previously, and much of our work, partly because of the sort of paucity of data early on with government data sets, would just give us a headline effect. And we'd say, overall, we have increased payment from 35 to 38%. We're now able to see increasingly, well, we increased it from 35 to 42% for this group, but it went down to 33% for this group. And that's really important when we actually start to really unpack what's going on. So, for example, in the tax space, just to stick with that example, we've seen that highlighting that you are part of the small minority that hasn't paid, very effective for the vast majority of the population. For the very wealthiest, or those with the biggest tax debt, actually has a small backfire effect. And again, there's different hypotheses as to why that might be, whether they already see themselves as part of the elite, etc., which we probably still need to unpack. But interesting to see that they almost react conversely. On the other hand, the message that is very effective for them, which is not effective for the rest of the population, is to highlight the negative impact that has on the loss of public services in a concrete way. So by not paying, this affects the ability to pay for schools, roads and hospitals. And again, you might then want to unpack why that is. Well, if you have a tax debt of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, that message has real resonance and meaning to you. If you are someone with a tax debt of tens or hundreds, saying that can't pay for schools, roads and hospitals is somewhat of an empty message. So even when it comes to those sort of small, seemingly sort of just little tweaks to the to letters, it's actually important to unpack what is going on, not only at a headline level, but also for subgroups as well.
The other panellists?
I guess this idea of universalism, which is inherent in a lot of economic theory, I feel that we're very much moving away from that, and I don't have any concern that there is no overarching behavioural economic theory. I think that what we are trying to do is understand what's actually going on out there, and not theoretically, how does this fit in with our currently existing models of what's actually going on out there. So it's just not too much of a concern for me.
What about you, Alex? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we, as anyone involved in almost any branch of science always loves a good theory, and a nice, clean, attractive, simple theory is always the most desirable of all. But I guess there's a lot of things you could say about that. I think it was it Harry Truman who said, please give me a one-armed economist, because the economist always says on the one hand this and on the one hand something else. He obviously hadn't spoken to many psychologists because they have many more than two hands. If you ever look at psychology, by comparison, there's even more phenomena. Like, well, within one of 100 things, let alone two. And obviously, a lot of people are familiar that psychology is going through a bit of a crisis of replication at the moment, which I actually think is slightly misnamed and is probably more accurately described as a crisis of overgeneralization. What's been happening in psychology is people have been finding out and running a test, finding something interesting in a particular context and saying, hey, look, this works for all of human behavior over all time. And I think, and then it has failed to replicate, and what that replication failure is probably telling us is that you overgeneralize, that actually that phenomenon may well be true, but it's only true in certain contexts, and that makes it hard then to predict which particular context is the one that will dominate at any given time. We would obviously love to have more kind of theoretical power to be able to say, well, in this scenario, this is the best outcome. We obviously talk to a lot of people in government, and we'd say, well, look, we think this might work, or here's 2 or 3 things that might work. What we'd really like to do is test them out. And often the response is kind of like, well, do we have to test them? Can't you just tell us? Just tell us the right answer now. And the answer is often, well, no, we can't really, unfortunately. I think what it speaks to is a lack of. I mean, government is not fundamentally set up to test its approach. On a basic level, governments are designed or structured around you design a good idea and you roll it out. There isn't, maybe you pilot it a little bit first. There's not a lot of competition. We don't very rarely run things against each other. And I think, in my mind, the biggest challenge going forward is to shift that entire culture to one where we routinely and systematically run multiple versions of multiple things at all times to test them out. In that scenario, whether or not your theory has to be, it becomes a bit less problematic. If you had that kind of culture built in, experimental government, you wouldn't mind the fact that we're going to have to test out 3 or 4 things. I think the frustration comes because we're not designed to do that, and therefore we really want the one solid prediction we know is going to work, which the theory tells us is right. But yeah, I mean, it would be lovely to have more universal theories. I think what's going to happen is a bit of a calibration going on, right? There probably was a bit of, in psychology at least, a bit of overgeneralization, and now people are kind of starting to throw it all out and say, well, nothing generalizes, it's all individual context. Like in most debates in science, I think the answer will probably end up being somewhere in the middle, right? We'll say, well, actually, no, there are some general principles, and there are some scenarios where you can know there are principles, and there are other general principles that affect those general principles. So you can draw some sensible conclusions, not necessarily universal conclusions, but more generalized, potentially to sort of groups or particular scenarios. And I think that's where it will end up calibrating. So I have hope yet that we will kind of come to that point.
So can I just respond
Yeah,
quickly? So I guess I'm quite sympathetic with this idea of the give and take between empirical and theoretical endeavor. And in fact, that's the way that scientific method has proceeded for generations. And the main reason why I'm so keen to push this notion that theory is important is because without a theoretical backbone, any science dies. And we're left with just a whole bunch of, what if, maybe, this in this context, perhaps, blah, blah, blah. And you don't have a framework on which to then continue to build and discover and innovate in a way that will produce as much as you otherwise could produce. You just have a lot of little ferreting arounds, and that doesn't make a science. That makes an application, certainly lots of applications, right? And so that's where my concern comes from. And at the moment, like when we teach economics, we are still teaching mainstream theory because we don't have a behaviorally informed theory. And so we got a lot of people coming through, undergraduates and even into graduate school, who don't know really anything about behavioral economics other than, oh, look, there's a few query, weirdo facts that get published in the QJE because they're not in line with theory that was developed 50 years ago. And that's not, to me, satisfying, and it doesn't, to me, bode well for the health of the discipline as a whole, as the subdiscipline as a whole. So that's why I'm keen on it, right? I also just like the intellectual, challenge of trying to come up with something like that, which is, ridiculously difficult. But I just also I'm concerned about the health of the science in academia and as a general social good.
So I'm going to put it to you, Gigi. What do you see as the opportunities then to change that and to go forward as a discipline, as a framework and a solid foundation that could be more sustainably applied into the future and embedded in government decision making?
Read my book. I mean, it's this is one of my life challenges. I mean, I'm not going to be able, humanity is not going to be able to come up with, the sort of definitive theory of behavioral economics in the next 20 years, I don't think. But I think that we should be working towards that, and I think that we should be firmly focused on, as economists, our value to society being to provide rough rules of thumb. And those rules of thumb, I totally agree with Michelle. They're not going to hold for everybody, right? And they are going to need to be tested out in piloting and, RCT-style interventions to try to work out what kind of intervention works in a particular context is always going to be necessary. But trying to pour effort into meaningful theoretical development that is informed by empirics, that draws on the evidence base that is just exponentially rising, with every year that goes by, in terms of how people react to all sorts of stimuli in all sorts of different social and economic contexts. That's what we should be doing. And I think we should not be doing as much, perhaps, sometimes, of the more removed theory, which doesn't take account of real economic situations that humans face.
I'm going to throw it open to the rest of the panel here. What do you all see as the opportunities then in going forward into the future that we haven't explored in behavioural economics? And what do we need to do to get there?
Happy to start off. By the way, I think we're in rampant agreement in terms of if we had that overarching theory and framework, it would certainly make our life a lot easier in making policy. I think it's just about how we get there. And also, I think, probably a greater precision and specificity about what we're doing and the type of approaches that we're using and how understandings of that do vary across disciplines, which I think we slightly gloss over at the minute. So I read a nice short blog by Andrew Geldman this morning or last night about mental accounting, and even what people understand by that. So from economists, you think about it from a sort of liquidity of money sense and be very focused on the person who's saving up for their college fund but running up big debts on their credit card and trying to understand sort of liquidity between that. Psychologists might be focused more on the sort of individual behaviours and rationalizations behind that. And sociologists might be focused more on the meaning and the relationships that means for them and their family. Or winter fuel allowance in the UK, where people get it and disproportionately spend it on heating, trying to understand the relationship to the state, etc. Some of those deeper meanings. That those disciplinary differences actually can add a huge amount to our sort of overall model and our understanding, but we probably talk about it slightly imprecisely at the minute and gloss over some of those differences where we could dig down a little deeper. In terms of where we go from here, I mean, there's probably two areas. One is more upstream. I think, as Gigi put it, we've been ferreting around a little bit, which we think is very important about improving and optimizing our services and trying to sort of work around some of the complexities of the system and the inefficiencies and the bureaucracies and making tweaks here and there and making incremental changes, which, again, I fundamentally believe is an important role for us to be doing. But, of course, we should be thinking about how do we influence the debate upstream. And
do you mean like policy and legislation or something else?
Absolutely. And look, we're beginning to see a little bit of that. So let's just take, someone mentioned health earlier. I think Gigi mentioned the sort of bananas in the school canteen and placement. I mean, it is interesting, and I think partly because of the use of behavioural science, we have been empirically testing things like placement in canteens and the effect on behaviour, and things like pricing. So, we supported some trials in Victoria which modelled the price of 20% increase in terms of full-fat drinks in a vending machine, and we're able to empirically show in this small trial, in this particular context of a hospital, that people were substituting from full-fat sugar and sweet beverages, full-fat Coke, essentially, to largely water and juices and more healthy options, which really helps to build the evidence base. We did some modelling around that to also show the likely impact of a sugar tax, and we ran, for example, a consultation with the public to try and understand their reaction to that. Because again, if you ask most people, do you think we should have a sugar tax? Most people say no, because they just hear the word tax and they sort of respond impulsively. Whereas if you sit people down and show them the evidence for a weekend, people are very intelligent and actually will largely support those sorts of measures. So in the UK, we've now are introducing a sugar tax, 20% on sugar and sweetened beverages, and it's not even come into effect yet, and you're already beginning to see some benefits in manufacturers reformulating their product to make sure that they sort of meet certain levels. So for me, they're the sorts of interventions, as well as we've looked at things like placement and tried to legislate and try to encourage schools and hospitals not to have fizzy drinks at all or to organise their food environments in certain ways. Like that should be, for me, where we're heading. So moving upstream, to me, is a big focus. And the second one is probably a better use of data, which we've already touched on a little bit, but better use of data science and predictive analytics with, again, the same humility that even if you get that model, doesn't necessarily mean that's how it will play out in practice and that will likely be biases within your data. But just take a couple of examples. We've recently done some work which is just about improving the focus of our regulation. So actually, if you scrape open data, you can make it more likely that your models of prediction of which GP surgeries are going to fail or hospitals fail, you can make those models more accurate by using a sort of broader suite of data and scraping often open data. But then, of course, you still need an intervention at that point. And, to be perfectly frank, we've been doing this now for 7 years, and it has felt like sometimes we are shooting in the dark a little bit. We're taking some of the theory, we're taking some of the field work, but the real data on what's driving behaviour, we often haven't had that much fine-grained behaviour, and we've had to have the same intervention for the whole group. I mean, that can't be the way that we're doing it in 5 or 10 years. We must have better data, be able to better target, be able to differentiate our interventions. Otherwise, we won't have moved the approach forward.
So it sounds like you're looking at some of the opportunities here. Are moving away, well, not just doing a little trial here, but consolidating that into a body of knowledge and actively advocating as a behaviouralist, this is what we need to do. because there probably hasn't been a lot of that so far, has there? Alex, you mentioned, I think earlier on, moving into more complex problems. Is that an opportunity you see, or do you see opportunities elsewhere as well for behavioural economics and policy?
Yeah, I think there are many opportunities. I'd agree with what Rory was saying on both the policy and the sort of data science point. It's a bit of a challenge of being on the same panel as Rory. We end up agreeing with a lot of things. I'll try and find points to disagree with you on. I'll try and see if I can work those in. I think the point about data science, machine learning, big data is all potentially quite a powerful complement to a lot of what happens in this space. And yes, absolutely, I agree that there was. We started off on a lot of this journey around fairly small changes, partly to legitimise it in what was potentially controversial set of techniques to apply in public policy contexts. People feel manipulated, or that we're somehow being underhand, Orwellian or Machiavellian, and so keeping it, proving the small and inoffensive changes could help was partly a way of building a legitimacy base, and I think there is scope to build on that to now extend it into much more complex social policy areas, and maybe that starts to move us slightly more into the psychological side of the story more than the behavioural economics. I'm not sure, so it's sometimes a bit hard to really think about them, disaggregate them meaningfully because they do overlap so much. But I think there are some of the interesting stuff around the character skills or non-cognitive skills. I think it's really interesting potential.
Can you just expand on that?
Potential sort of frontier for the science. So looking at things like many of the social issues we see can be underpinned by things like anger management, impulse control, poor planning. Now some of that can be driven by circumstances where we was talking earlier, bandwidth taxes and so on. Sometimes people genuinely have poor skills or low psychosocial resilience or things like that. And those potentially could touch on all sorts of things, their employment, their life course, their well-being, their health, decisions to smoke, take drugs, starting crime, getting into the criminal justice system, and potentially intervening in those kind of non-cognitive skills early on in the life course could shift an entire pathway. I think it's still in my mind, it's still an open question about whether, for example, trying to take someone away and train them in impulse control is actually effective. But I think if something that is a really exciting frontier for us. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting one. It's quite hard to do in government. We tend to approach things from the point of view of symptoms. So we look at things and say, oh, that's a justice problem or a health problem or an education problem. We often don't look at common underpinning factors, that there are particular groups of people or particular characteristics of people that cause them to touch on many parts of the system. It's just fundamentally not the way government works. We divide government into agencies and departments with remits, with specific targets related to things like criminal justice or health, and trying to actually look, the problem of impulse control underpins many aspects of here, or flaws in metacognition or whatever it might be, underpin many things here. That's much harder for us as government to organisationally tackle. Another thing I guess just to add on to that was, for me, on a theoretical basis, there are two really interesting interfaces just personally. I think Gigi mentioned the issue of time. I think that's a really interesting sort of addition to the theory, often left out of a lot of the discussion around this. When you start to really understand the human relationship with time, cognitive effort and things like that, I think a lot of apparent irrationality starts to fall into place. And I have high hopes that by, there was a few years ago a part of economics thing called heterodox economics that was trying to factor that in. I still have high hopes that some of that could yield some really genuinely interesting theoretical insights. And the other part, again, I think Gigi mentioned about the interface with neuroscience, I think is potentially very interesting. I think some of the things about looking at the human brain and understanding that could potentially unlock another level of understanding of some of these slightly odd things at the moment we're looking at purely from an environmental context, might actually have common underpinning neurological drivers, which then again may allow us to increase that kind of predictive power, or at least understand some of the theory there. So a bit of a mixed bag. There's some sort of practical stuff, but I think there's also some interesting parts to the theory for me.
Yeah, that's definitely an unexplored area of that personal psychological development, which is so important to human capital and skills that I don't think we've really looked at. I'm going to open it up on a slightly different topic, and maybe start with you, Michelle. Michelle, you could have done a number of different policy roles and looked at the environment or looked at justice. You decided to look at behavioural sciences. and that's focused your career in a specific way, starting at the ABS and then now working in behavioural sciences. Now that's been a bit of a journey, I'm sure. How has it transformed you personally working this area, and how do you look at the world a little bit differently now as a policymaker than you would have if you followed a career in maybe a straight policy role?
I guess how the decisions that I've made to work in this area have affected me is I've probably become a little bit more cynical when I hear most ideas or theories, or I often question, where is this coming from? What are the assumptions that are underpinning it? And I think particularly, Rory, what you were saying before about having different disciplines working together, I think that is absolutely where the future is headed. And I think that for disciplines to be working effectively, you need to understand the different reference points that they have. So Gigi referenced earlier the individual atomistic agents. That's not the reference point for other social science type theories, which could be more community-based. So what my career has, how it's influenced me is to not really see there as being one objective truth that we are all trying to unpack and uncover, but seeing most things as context specific, historically specific, culturally specific. And therefore, if we're wanting from a policy or regulatory perspective to help our population and respond to these issues, you need to understand that very specific context in which things take place, and not just apply a theory and hope that that works for all people in that area.
Sure, looking at the context is very important. We'll be a little bit, we don't want to waste too much time without the audience having questions, so I'm going to throw it out to the rest of you. How has it changed you, Gigi? Quickly.
Most dramatically, I guess, in two ways. The first would be that in the context of my research, I have worked on theories of how loyalty and love develop, and that is very sobering. Because if you really come up with something you believe is as close as we can get to the true story of how love develops in a person, that means that your own loves are then, a product of those processes. So it's very almost dehumanizing of your own very, closely held feelings and commitments, attachments. And that's challenging from a personal perspective. The second is really the time issue. So I want to emphasize the previous comments about time. It's, I'm also, a mother, full-time worker, a lot of volunteer stuff, sandwich generation. And I'm really, really conscious of how I use my time, how I focus on things, what I don't focus on specifically. I'm much, much more aware of that. I think part of it is just age, and part of it is just being an economist. But the behavioral stuff definitely plays a role, because I'm more cognizant of things like, if somebody brings something to my attention, I'm going to be more drawn to that. Don't get drawn to it just because they're in your face. All right, keep your priorities. I know what my mind is going to want to say, oh yeah, okay, come into my office. You know what? No, I don't have time. Sorry. And being more, militant about trying to correct for the biases that I think I probably have in the way that I use my time has helped me. I feel better about it, because I feel like I'm using my time more optimally, considering my objective function. Right.
Never waste a behavioural economist's time. You will pay. Alex, can I throw it over to you?
Yeah, I guess two things I'd say. One is working in this area probably makes me a little bit more sympathetic of people. I think seeing and understanding more about how how many biases and factors there are at play in the human mind, and that can influence so much as to how much that is driven by our circumstance and life course and so on. It's made me probably a slightly more forgiving person. To sort of see, I understand that what you like. To me, it looks like you're being an asshole, but actually, I understand now that you're just exhibiting a particular bias or group of biases that's perfectly predictable.
Some people have more biases than others.
Some do have more biases than others. Some demonstrate more than others. But it made me just, I guess, maybe just notched up my sympathy levels a little bit. Kind of making me, I guess, sort of playing off that kind of fundamental attribution area, starting to think a little bit more about the environmental context in which people are making the decisions. People should be making poor decisions and thinking, well, that's probably a result of things like the scarcity of cognitive capacity and time and things like that coming into effect. The other one, I guess, is I would say I'm genuinely happier working in this area than I have been for a while in my career. I came into government from a background in physical sciences and was flabbergasted probably about how little evidence there was in government, just generally, how so many key decisions were made and hundreds of billions of pounds in the UK sloshed around based on prejudice and preconception and political ideology and very little evidence on anything, and was pretty appalled by a lot of that. And I think has always been a key theme of my career is about trying to bring evidence into government, and I think this is the first area I've worked in where it genuinely feels like we are really making progress there. We've really actually managed to start to bring in things like randomised control trials into government and genuinely start to test things and form a much more solid empirical base for decision making. And I have hopes that having cracked open that door, that it'll only get more and more over time. So, yeah, I think it's really personally inspiring for me to see that.
Rory, finally with you.
Just quickly on the empiricism, again, I think that's one of the things I've enjoyed most, but it is interesting. So, there's so much more reward, I think, from working on something and then seeing if you get a result. But that reward is much higher when the result is positive. And I was very fortunate early in my career, and I think partly because we were fixing such broken systems that we got lots of very, very positive results. And ministers loved it, and they love testing and trialling because it always got positive results. And we are, as we get into more complex problems, that isn't always going to be the case. And I've certainly been involved stuff more regularly recently where we don't see a positive effect. And it is still great to know that, but it doesn't feel quite as personally rewarding as when something does work. And adjusting our own mindset to that, I think, will be important. And secondly, sort of recognising our own personal biases. I think one of the reasons I am so interested in this area is I see how subject I am to many of these biases, and my system one taking over in all of the consumer markets and weight loss and all of those other things. But I often held quite dear, I think, the difference between my personal life and my professional life. And actually what I found more challenging is realising the biases I have at work, including in things like recruitment. And until recently, I hadn't really thought about that, and I would have always said, look, some other people can't interview and recruit very well, but just give me the CV and a quick interview and I'll pick the best candidates for the job. And of course I can't, I'm subject to all of those biases and unconscious biases, and actually challenging my own thoughts around how I manage that at work and projects, etc., I found more challenging, but probably more valuable.
Yeah, it really does open your eyes up. That even behavioural economists aren't immune to biases in their own lens. I'm going to open it up to you all now to have questions. We've got the first one down the front, straight off the cab, and then we've got a microphone that's coming around. So, yep.
Thank you all. It's very interesting. It strikes me that a lot of the findings of behavioural research point to the conclusion that the choices we observe people making are not necessarily what they really want. And so, sort of thinking about some of these findings, how do we bring them into our frameworks for policy evaluation and cost-benefit analysis? And can our frameworks handle behavioural economics, or do they need to adapt?
I think what's really interesting in that question is the idea that people do or don't know what they want, as well as I think associated with that is what is or is not good for a person. So particularly in finance, there are ideas of, say, someone holding an insurance policy that isn't necessarily, if you look at it purely dollar-wise, maybe isn't the best product for them, but it makes them feel safer and secure. So I think that idea of what people want and what is good for them is it's something that we're still navigating, I would say. Yeah.
So this is more a question for the practicing behavioural economists, and it's at once both an extremely philosophical and extremely practical question. I'd like to know behavioural economics is all about intervention. Who in your teams or who in your organisations defines better and right with respect to behaviour?
So I think that's exactly what I was just touching upon. And I don't think that there is any one person that defines what is better or what is right. I think when it comes to financial outcomes, if someone loses all of their money in a Ponzi scheme, bad outcome. There are some simple right and wrongs like that. But as that example with an insurance product, if I see you're kind of not convinced by that, they're allowed to take that risk and they're allowed to make that loss if they want. Is that the... But as I say, with the insurance product, if that gives them peace of mind, whether it's not actually a good financial product for them to be holding, is that a good product or not a good product? It's kind of about people making, I guess, good choices, not the best choices. You can't push them into doing that, I guess. But that's in the finance world where there is a lot of ambiguity compared to, say, smoking or the health world.
Alex, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this is it depends on where you come from in the world. A lot of our behavioural economics colleagues will often start from that kind of point of view. What is best for the individual? What would they choose? And I guess coming from government, our response is to, well, the answer to your question is the government's already made that decision for us in many ways. So we've already decided that, for example, that crime is bad and that you committing a crime is a bad thing to do. And so what we're normally doing is working in support of pre-existing established government priorities and areas. Again, things like you being overweight. We've already taken the decision that government will act to reduce your weight or try to reduce the number of people who are overweight. So in some senses, the sort of the kind of underpinning morality of it is really kind of filters through our kind of democratic system. They define the things they're trying to achieve, and then we're just working to support that. We, I guess, don't really try to get too caught up in the decision about what are the right areas to be focusing on. We're just supporting those. It's a bit of a cop-out, I suppose, but I think it is a live issue, right? And there are sometimes occasions where those neatly line up, that both the social good and the private good line up neatly. And then there are times when they diverge and actually, might be worse for society if you do this, but it's actually better for you, makes you happier. I imagine there are some cases even around things like smoking and drinking. You say, I love smoking and drinking. I don't care if I die early. Why are you trying to stop me? Just because it happens to impose some costs on the healthcare system. You can get a divergence between the social and the personal good at that point, and that is a little bit harder to deal with from a kind of moral perspective. In government, so we tend to kind of go with the social good at the end of the day. Is if you're imposing some kind of cost on other people, then we'll try and adjust that behaviour.
We had a lady just down here who had a question. Can we get the mic to her first?
Is it one of you ladies?
Who was it that had the question?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a lady, over there,
Hi. So the Behavioural Economics team of Australia recently came out with a report on gender discrimination and hiring in the APS. And there were some, I guess, criticisms of the paper because the report was kind of based on this hypothetical hiring scenario as opposed to an actual hiring experiment. So I'm just kind of wondering, how do you reconcile the opportunity for governments to evaluate policy through things like randomized controlled trials in real, externally valid environments like hiring people in the APS, and kind of weighing also the ethical concerns that such policy evaluation methods might bring about?
It's actually funny. I just come from a meeting. Previous meeting was exactly on that topic. Look, I mean, the beta report was a frame field experiment, so the people knew they were in experiment. I don't think that necessarily. It doesn't invalidate, but it does kind of put corollaries around what you do with the results of that. An interesting piece of research opens up a debate in an interesting way. I guess it's important to say that they were only ever intending that would be an opener, not the definitive answer. Is there bias in the public service recruitment process, yes or no? It was an easy way to open up the question. Ideally, you'd follow that up with more of a conventional, natural sort of field experiment where, as has been done in this space, you'd send CVs to people who didn't know they were in an experiment and asked them just to see if they selected candidates, yes or no. So I think the main aspect for me about this one is that the risk of doing an interesting piece of research that's then kind of taken a little bit out of proportion by the media coverage of it. They set out to do an interesting piece of research and did, and I think it opens up a debate about the value of blinding in selection processes. It by no means, in my mind, is the final word. Very much the contrary, it's an opener. It has, in some cases, been presented as the final word, and the answer has been solved now. Blinding is a waste of time. In fact, it makes things worse. I think that's just something you've got to it's got to manage in thinking through. It's beholden on all of us in the work that we're doing. Think about how it's interpreted and how we then present it back, and what is our duty in terms of explaining the limitations of what we do. And it's hard sometimes to get your message across to the media. You'll put all the conditions attached to it. This is our finding. Here are the limitations. And all those limitations we neatly stripped out in the final press coverage of it, just to get a more interesting story. But I think it's just something to be alive to and keep watching out for.
Any other comments before we go on? Yep, next question.
So I really welcome the discussion of the need for a theory in all of this, that you sort of can go along for a while and learn a lot from the empirics, and that there's some sort of framing theory in behavioral economics, which needs to go beyond nudges, it gets kind of boring, is really important. But the challenge, it seems to me, and I don't have an answer to this question, but maybe some of you do, is how do you get to an interdisciplinary theory? Because in the end, you've got to involve psychologists. I mean, the economists' talk on soft skills is, complemented by internal locus of control and other things that psychologists measure. There's even some biological stuff and genetic stuff in there. And so it strikes me it's a really powerful area, but it may require, developing a theory may really require real interdisciplinary collaboration. And, how do you get there? Or how do we collectively get there?
So that's a fabulous question. One of the biggest barriers in being an academic, you'll understand this, is the siloization of academia. Nobody listens to you really if you are in the interdisciplinary space. You must declare a particular discipline home. As much as people claim, we love interdisciplinary research, all the university administrations, they want you to collaborate across faculties, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, the journal ranking systems, the refereeing systems are all referential towards a particular discipline, which means careerist incentives are organized around those silos, right? And so I guess that was why Paul and I decided that we would not call our book an interdisciplinary book, but rather a behavioral economics book. You could call it the former, but we thought that would be a worse marketing decision. We are both economists, so that's one thing, but of course we're surveying a lot of other disciplines and we're trying to bring those into economics, and the reason really is not just, I hope, an ex post rationalization that we're both economists and that was what we should have done. But also the objective reality that of all of the social science disciplines that have tried to provide models of human behavior that are useful in prediction and policy making, economics has arguably been the most successful. So if you're going to choose one discipline to use as the basic framework, it may be the best choice. That was our position. That was the call we made. And we said, okay, if that's the base, then reach from that base to the other disciplines and try to bring that back to us. And we thought that would be the most successful in terms of gaining traction because it is still within a particular discipline, but it also is validating the crown jewels of these other disciplines as well. And certainly, if there are people in psychology and sociology and anthropology, whatnot, who find that approach to be appealing, that's great. But we are trying to speak to economists because we think that's the most promising starting point.
Rory?
Yeah, just great. Yeah, great question. And I definitely don't have an answer to it, but it is worth remembering. Even the book Nudge is an interdisciplinary product. Cass Sunstein, who's a lawyer, regulator, and Richard Thaler, who's a pretty hardcore, Chicago economist. And actually, there's a lot of people have argued that it would never have been taken seriously at the heart of government if it was written by a psychologist. The fact that it was written by a regulator and a very well-respected economist meant that it was taken seriously. They were drawing very heavily on psychology, but it took that sort of interdisciplinary approach. And even, I'd slightly make this point flippantly, but I believe it to be true, originally those articles were around libertarian paternalism. Do we think that any of us would be here today if they'd pushed ahead with that? Maybe, maybe not. It was their publisher that said, let's call this nudge, and all of a sudden it went, mainstream, and politicians and others could very viscerally understand what was meant by this concept. And actually by framing it in a way which many people found accessible and writing the book in a way, I think it gained traction in a way that if it was written sort of purely by maybe a couple of economists in an academic journal, it would never have had the influence that it did. But it is hard work. So, Tim Harford's recent book on Messy talks about this, having lots of different people in the room from disciplinary backgrounds and different, not just disciplinary backgrounds, but actually different backgrounds, not just policymakers and academics, but front lines and service users, is really productive. It's really bloody hard and sometimes super awkward. And it can feel quite gritty, but hopefully the payoff is worth it in the end. And in fact, I just came from a meeting this morning, just kicking off some work looking at the types of decisions that teenagers make online. And absolutely, to solve that problem, you need software engineers, you need designers, you need behavioural scientists, you need educators, you need people from the mental health space. And I'm super excited by it, but it will be really hard to try and come up with what your overarching theory or framework for understanding these behaviours are, but I think hopefully it will pay off.
I also think it's a really fascinating question, and I think it is where academia needs to be heading. And I know that the university administration is so pro cross-disciplinary research, but I suspect, and I'm not sitting within academia myself, but I suspect that the answer to how to get more cohesive theories that are interdisciplinary is to get to the basic building blocks of the theories, not to work just at the outcomes or to really, for anyone who's trying to do that interdisciplinary work, to understand the deep assumptions that are held by whatever the other discipline that you're working with, so you can create something that has a similar worldview, I guess, because there are, whenever I dip into any different discipline, there are just different assumptions about why, about how. There's different ontological approaches to understanding how to understand the world. So I think you need to get to the bottom, not just work at the edges, if that makes sense.
So maybe start working with disciplines where there is a common language to begin with, and then get to the base of those fundamental.
That would be the low-hanging fruit approach. I think that this probably is the way of the future, but it might still be a long way off to getting. I find it strange that disciplines do have such divergent ways of understanding the world. There is just the one world, but then, as I say, there is no. Yeah,
well, that's a whole.
I don't think it's strange at all. It's identity formation in action.
Yeah.
What about you, Alex? You actually come from a completely different discipline originally. What do you see as some solutions to that very big problem?
I don't know. If I think I had the answer to that, I'd probably be in a different job. No, I think all these are valid points. I mean, the point of language, I think, is an interesting one just to pick up on, without getting kind of overly philosophical about this. Wittgenstein said about the limits of our language set the boundaries of our world, and it does kind of form into that. The way we talk is part of our identity and is part of defining ourselves as a group. Just an interesting anecdote on that was we did some work when I first entered the government, trying to bring together essentially biologists and computer scientists, and we actually hired interpreters effectively to try and look at the way they kind of understood systems and the way they used terminology, and to translate that into essentially a kind of, or to show the commonality, and find that actually many of the times they were talking about the same thing but using a very different frame to do that, and by trying to expose some of that actually managed to kind of bring them together. It's something I observe even within our own team. People with psychological backgrounds, people with an economic background will often use essentially totally different terms for what is fundamentally the same concept, and when you start to bring them together, you can expose that and start to see what is similar and what is different as well. Sometimes they'll come at things from quite different, but it can be a really creative tension. So although it can sometimes cause a bit of confusion or even a bit of conflict at times, it is a very creative tension and a very creative conflict. So I know I don't have any solutions on how you do it. I guess one of the advantages of being more in that applied space is that we can do that a bit more liberally. We're not so beholden to pure academic silos. We have our own silos to worry about, but we can bring together people from multiple disciplines and try and put them into practice. And there can, I think, sometimes be a healthy feedback from the kind of practitioner to theoretician. You know, if you can't always crack it on a theoretical level, sometimes if we can show it's working in practically by bringing together, that can then kind of feed back into theoretical systems as they then try to justify and explain that. So hopefully there can be a kind of constructive feedback loop going there.
And maybe also part of that identity formation is actually a part of the hindrance, and maybe a part of the answer is removing the ego from the interdisciplinary work, so removing the allegiance to a particular idea and allowing yourself to unlearn and relearn rather than...
Good luck.
Yeah.
There is nothing like the staying power of a bad idea in social science.
We have another question.
Excuse me. Hello. I was just listening recently to an interview with the fellow who's brought down the UK government report into gig economy type jobs, Deliveroo and Uber, and he was saying that he was much more into the idea of nudges than regulation. And I guess there's two questions. Firstly, if it's being used in that way, is the term nudge kind of being diluted to the point of meaninglessness? And also, I'm skeptical that organisations that have carefully calibrated payments to their workers or not workers, however you want to call them, everything is done and calculated in such a specific way, amenable to being nudged to behave in more socially acceptable or, beneficial ways. Do you think that there's a limit to what behavioural economics can do relative to regulation, and what would you say that limit is?
Look, I think it's just on terminology. We personally try to avoid using the phrase nudge at all possible. It's kind of hard, especially in events, because people like to talk about it. I think it is a slightly meaningless term, to be honest with you, so that's why we try to steer away from it. We try to use more precise terminology. It has a kind of public appeal, which is why it kind of keeps coming back. It's kind of intuitive in some ways. But yeah, I don't think it's actually it's that helpful a terminology. I think it's a little bit confusing because different people take it to mean quite different things, and then again, they never expose those different assumptions of what that really means. The point about... sorry, your second point was about whether people are amenable to, or is it an alternative to regulation? Yeah. No, I don't see... And again, this is a slightly... It's a slightly more dominant in the North American debate on the topic about whether nudging is an alternative to regulation. I think we haven't traditionally had so much of that thinking here in Australia or anywhere outside of North America. It was very much sort of originally sold as a bit of a this is an alternative to regulation by a certain part of the community. And I think that is a bit of a false dichotomy. I really don't. I don't see it as a separate thing that you do. I think it's the most effective thing you can do is to look at all the tools that are available and think about how you're effectively going to combine them. Even the way you do regulation can itself draw on behavioural theory, as Cass Sunstein was trying to show at OIRA. So I really think it's a common, but I think a false dichotomy to kind of try and push them apart. I think you should really just look at what are all the tools available and try and bring them all together. That's going to get far more impact, bringing together the subtleties of the behavioural sciences with your incentives, with your regulation, with your information, all classical tools of government, and thinking about, even within incentives or information, which are kind of classic tools, the way you provide incentives we know can be different, the way you provide information. So I think behavioural sciences brings a new lens to kind of current tools rather than genuinely offering a totally new skill set.
Any other quick comments from the panel?
Just on the organisational point, organisations are still made up of people, so often they don't self-correct, and we've seen similar interventions, for example, sending a tax letter to an individual or an organisation. Some of those techniques have been equally effective at the organisational level, so we need to understand much, much, much more about it, but I don't think again, it's not the sort of binary that it might seem, individual versus completely rational or organisation.
Given we have only time for one more last question, I think we've got the lady there. If you'd like. No, it's good. Please.
Mine kind of segues from the last point, which was Firstly, on the interdisciplinary, I was wondering whether political scientists have had any role, any input, feedback, whatever. And related to that, and this is me showing complete ignorance about this area of behavioural economics, but I wondered if it is context determined, because is there a different implication if it's used by, say, private, or can it be applied by private corporations, government, by in a consensus context? Do we have to assume that we are in a quote-unquote democracy, or is it applicable in a dictatorship? I think nudge might work for Uber workers, if only because they sort of have little choice, so it's overdetermined. I doubt that employers would be hugely motivated by, if not nudge, if whatever the signals that would come from a behavioural economics approach. So I'm just kind of thinking about the power issues. Sorry, it's not even a question.
Gigi? What?
Power, yeah, very, very important, and generally unrecognized by economists except in respect of the notion of market power, which is a very limited notion of power. Political science, at least speaking personally in terms of my own research endeavors, is definitely a major source of inspiration and information. And I mean, at the moment, I've been running experiments that have to do specifically with coalition formation. Have a grant that's about corruption, and we are trying to look at the links between the polity and the economy. I have to plug a session on inequality tomorrow, which is going to be talking about the nexus between politics and economics. And, definitely very, very relevant. Now, whether or not companies would be more influenced by nudge-type interventions or governments would, I think for me the main question there is whether or not the nudging or the use of the behavioral insights is being put towards the common good. Which I think, Alex is oriented towards that as well, and he's mentioned this before, that the general orientation of economists is to try to promote aggregate welfare. At least that was what I was always taught, and that's what I've always tried to do. However, a lot of economists do end up working for the dark side at some point in their careers. And when you are applying it in a partisan way, you can get just as much power, as you could if you're applying it in a socially, benevolent way. And so, yeah, I do worry sometimes about, letting the cat out of the bag too much, and then the consultants just have a field day in getting companies to uptake behavioral nudges or whatnot that will make people buy more of their stuff, because I don't necessarily think that's great for social welfare. So, yeah, I think of that as a concern, but I'll let the other people answer.
I think on a purely prosaic level, I think the tools can work here almost irrespective of who's applying them. And yeah, we know a little bit less about applying tools to organisations, but what we do know is just that often they display quite similar behaviour, partly because that point about they are fundamentally made up of people. I think a really interesting part for me is there's that moral licence. To what extent do we have a moral licence to apply the techniques to what we do? I've often made the point that I think the public sector is playing catch-up with the private sector, actually, in this space. If you've ever been into a supermarket, you'll be exposed to more nudges than government will do for your entire lifetime, I'm pretty sure, from a single trip to the supermarket, because they are incredibly carefully constructed environments. And so I think what we're doing is really sort of starting to scratch the surface of what has been quite mainstream in a lot of parts of the private sector. I think there is an interesting question about the moral license. That we're very conscious of our moral license and the ethics of what we do, and put a very high bar around everything we do. That is not the case outside of government. People quite happily use techniques that would be considered quite manipulative to sell their products. My suspicion is just that it hasn't really caught on yet. I mean, if you think back to the 1950s and the outcry that happened around subliminal advertising, I think we might be due at that again at some point, and someone will kind of make the point that we as consumers are being massively manipulated, and that there will then be an outcry and a request for regulation. I don't quite know what that looks like. How do you stop someone using publicly available evidence on behaviour in designing something? But I think there will probably at some point be a big public debate about the use of behavioural science by specifically the private sector to to sell products. But I just think it hasn't happened yet because it hasn't hit the consciousness yet.
So I think that it's probably been used by the private sector for a long time, just not called behavioural science. It's called marketing. And it's not evidence-based other than that they can see their profits going up. So there aren't RCTs, but I guess that is evidence. They implement a certain nudge or intervention or design a product in a particular way, or the packaging or the way that they sell it to somebody. And I guess from our perspective as the regulator, in some of our projects, we try to identify where private sector has used behavioural techniques, whether they're aware that they've used the behavioural techniques, but to get people to make decisions that maybe aren't in their obvious best interests. But how you, separate to a private organisation, determine whether that is occurring or not, it's quite difficult to diagnose from the outside. But I think there's a lot of subliminal techniques that have been used for decades now. In terms of the cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and whether we can draw on the work of political science, I think the heterodox economics community has probably been trying to encourage more interdisciplinariness, more so than the orthodox economics community. So maybe that's where orthodox economists could probably get some influence or inspiration by as well.
Rory, you have a question? Okay, well, I've certainly started thinking a bit more deeply about where behavioural economics is positioned and how we move forward into using more a unified approach and a approach that isn't a fickle one that can go into the future, and really learn more about how everyone's been transformed on their journey. I would encourage people at the end of this session, if you have any questions for the particular panellists, just to come straight up here. Would you all join me in thanking our panellists today for their time?